Well, once we get going,
Yeah.
I organized all the questions people sent. So
Okay.
there's some flow, but we'll kind of go back and forth asking questions. And I mean, I'm not super worried
No,
because like
it's a
we
great
both
book.
read the book and liked it, and people sent lots of cool questions. Um, if we ask one of you the question first, if other people want to say something before we go to some other topic, just jump in and talk to each other. Y'all wrote a book together, so I'm sure you figured out who who you should pass to at some point. So, uh, and you know, if something happens in the live version that we can edit it before it's on the podcast and how it is permanently available. So don't lose any sleep about it.
People are beginning to put in their names and where they're coming from on the call, and it's great to see, especially look at we've got so many more Canadians Tripp tonight. I can't figure out why that would be. I think that Erin has brought all of her friends from across our great neighbors to the north.
And I would tell all of you that are on here, you don't have to watch the comments or the Q&A stuff. We will do that, and you'll only see the ones that are on Zoom, but it's also streaming on YouTube and on Facebook. So there will be more questions and things being sent in as we go. And if they say nice stuff to you, or at the end when people are like, thank you, that was so wonderful, I will save the text chat so you can go back and look at it later, like if former student leaves a nice note or something. So don't worry about that. It'll all exist, because it's hard to talk about a book you spent years writing with two friends and read the chat box.
And how long are we going to go?
I mean, usually around 70-ish minutes, but
Okay. Thank you.
Based on the energy, and there's enough of you. So if you have to go like the restroom, go get water or anything, just turn off your video and then come back, because most people will only see who's talking except in transition moments. So if you turn your camera off, it won't even show anything. That's how the settings are. So
Oh, great.
All right, 1 second.
Okay.
I'm pulling up the app. So
how many people do we have checking in, Tripp? Because then it looks like it's slowed down a little bit to me.
307 is what I see.
Yeah. But there's
also got like, two other things going on that we can't see.
Right, that's what I was saying. Yeah, so so it's also on the homebrew page and in the group and on YouTube. So
are people still checking in on the other ones as well?
Yeah, I got them all on my phone. The Restream app that I use like pulls all the comments and onto an app, so I can follow along without having 9 windows open. So we're good.
Okay.
Excellent.
You tell me when to start, when you think the enough folks are all checked in, Tripp.
Yeah, I'll hit record, say something to people on here, and then the part that'll be permanent. We can do that.
Okay, great. I'll just wait for you. Waiting for your cue.
All right, there we go. Oh, and so if you are on, everyone that's joining us, thank you. We're gonna have a lot of fun. Before we begin, and scare quotes, remember, if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A function for things you want us to see. If you send us an email or a message, I've read them all and orchestrated it and wove them together in the most popular topics we hope to get to. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, your comments will show up here as well, so you can put them in. And we're gonna have fun. So and if you are in the middle of cooking dinner or about to start cooking dinner, you will get the nice edited version. We'll end up on the internet tomorrow, so you don't have to sweat it. If dinner calls or parenting duties or traffic, it'll all be available later online. So no worries. All right, I'm going to hit core. All right. Now you can take it away, Diana.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Welcome tonight to this special. It's a special event that's in conjunction with the class that Tripp and I have been doing over the whole period of Lent, Deconstructed Jesus. When this opportunity came up to host these three amazing scholars of early Christianities, I'm never gonna have it be single again. We jumped at it because we just knew that the historical, biblical, sort of contextual questions of Jesus would play a large role in the 6-7 weeks that Tripp and I are spending with you. And so we have with us three astonishingly smart people this evening. We have Aaron Vercombe, who is from the University of Toronto. Hal Tossing, recently retired from Union Theological Seminary in New York, and Brandon Scott at Phillips Theological Seminary. They are the authors of this wonderful book, After Jesus, Before Christianity, which comes from, it's published by Harper One. I have to say it's a favorite of my publisher of mine, since it's also my publisher. And we have so much to get to, but I wanted to begin by reading two paragraphs at the very end of the book, assuming that many of you haven't gotten to the end of the book yet, that I think put a wonderful frame around their work and connect it to what Tripp and I have been sharing with you over the last weeks. And so they're talking at the end of the book, in the conclusion of what their goal of this whole project has been. And they say, rather, the goal was the nourishment of an ongoing willingness to see and respectfully attempt to understand the other, many others, to not believe that things are or have to be a certain way, to hear voices completely different from our own and completely different from those of our present moments. The goal was to hear voices that have gone unheard, the voice of a rag dealer who joined an anointed supper club, the voice of a female head of household supporting a Jesus group in her home, despite and against the norm of the Roman father-centered family. Our unknowing, however, is not an act of deconstruction. It is a radical act of imaginative construction. The construction of new, authentic, exciting possibilities for meaning is enabled when we asked, what can we understand about the lived experiences of the diverse peoples who associated in different ways with Jesus across the ancient Mediterranean when we start assuming nothing? We have essentially discovered that the bed has indeed floated out to sea. What's more, it's not just a bed anymore. It is also a boat, a raft, the immense hump of a whale, a small island refuge, the haunt of a wandering albatross. And I think that so many people who have been with us over these weeks will hear that quote and go, oh my gosh, that's what I've been waiting for. That it's not just about taking something apart, but it's about putting something together that gives us a new landing place in this sort of chaotic moment. And so I just want to thank all three of you, because I felt like that's what you did. Some of the scholarship I was familiar with, other bits of it I was not. I was reminded of things I know, learned some things I didn't know, and found myself going, oh my gosh, why didn't anybody tell me this sooner? And when I got to those two final paragraphs in the conclusion, I was literally jumping out of my chair saying, hooray. So I don't have that response to that many books. And I wanted to make sure you knew that I had that response to your book. So Tripp, you want to begin where we where we begin? Maybe
Oh yeah.
asking our authors about the six things that they draw from this whole project.
Yeah, well, in going through the group, people kept sending in Bible questions, and Diana and I are like, well, you know, I do philosophy of religion and theology, and Diana, it's like I'm a church historian, so we've been saving Bible questions. Then they started reading your book, and even more Bible questions came in. Uh, and because so many people in the group vary in background, maybe they went to a place like Phillips with Brandon or at Union or, you know, something like that, or this is the first time they've read biblical scholars. And so I think it would be a really good place to begin would be for each of you to say, what was the question or moment you fell in love with the critical historical study of the early church and the religious lives that are going on there, that kind of gave you the impetus to end up doing all the struggle to get to producing a work like this?
Because let's start with Brandon. He's been kind of quiet in the corner. Then we'll go to Aaron and then Hal.
First moment I fell in love with I remember, being attracted to the historical understanding. I grew up as a Roman Catholic, so Bible was not in my bailiwick. And all through graduate school, they used to tease if I could get the book right, it was a miracle. Because I just didn't have everything in my memory. I was learning this, and from the beginning, I was attracted to understanding it historically, and that's primarily where I've been all along. The first real thing where it locked down to me that this is something that can fundamentally is worth dealing with because it's asking fundamental questions was when I started to work on the parables of Jesus. That's where it really hit. There was something going on there that was really different than just about anything else I was seeing. And that fascinated me then, and it continues to fascinate me.
For me, I fell in love with the historical study of these early Jesus movements when I was an undergraduate, and I was taking a class called Introduction to the New Testament, as it was called then. And there was one particular class in particular. Anyway, there's one class, special class, where we were talking about the Gospel of John, and we were talking about the end of the Gospel of John, where Mary Magdalene meets Jesus in the garden, and they have this conversation, and Mary doesn't recognize Jesus at first until they've talked for a while, and then there's this moment of recognition. And the professor had us act out this scene, which was something that we'd never done before and something that I'd never done in an undergraduate class. And I was pretty interested in Mary Magdalene at the time, so I volunteered to play Mary Magdalene. And the professor was clear that he wanted us to do whatever the gospel said, literally perform that action. So I'm at the front of the class and I'm talking to my fellow student who's playing Jesus. And then there's this line that says, Mary turns when she recognizes him. And we were already having a conversation, and the professor had said to do literally what the text tells you to do. And I got really confused. I was like, well, do I turn in a circle? Do I turn my back? Where am I turning? This really doesn't make any sense to me. Which of course the professor knew was going to happen, and it opened up a conversation about what the verb in Greek to turn means. And it can mean a physical turning, but it can also mean an inward kind of turning as well. And that was just so amazing to me in that particular moment. It made me want to learn Greek. It made me much more curious about gender in the early Jesus movements and the roles that gender could play. And I was hooked. It was that one classroom activity, that one afternoon when I was an undergrad.
Wow. I can see how that relates to some of the things that are said about the Gospels as cultural artifact and performance too. So, boy, that's a very cohesive story about a calling, and then how you see your work playing out as a scholar. That's great.
I think for me, there are many turns, but one of the most dramatic for me was about halfway through my career in these early texts. And I was already a lot on the road, speaking to the public. And I increasingly had people come up after my talks and ask me about what I thought of particular texts that were not in the Bible or New Testament, but were being discovered recently. And this 20 years or so into my work, I, by and large, told them what my professors had told me. And that was all of these new texts aren't worth anything. They're heretical and that you don't need to worry about them. I went through that for 2 or 3 years of being on the road, and they kept coming, those questions. And I didn't know much at all about those texts because they really had come before me. But the public kept on coming at me after that. And they started saying, you're wrong. This text that I wrote, let's say the Gospel of Mary, that I found out has meant a lot to me. That came over and over again to me throughout my going out into the public. And I finally, much belatedly, decided that I had to listen to them. So a nice inversion that the professor was converting to listening to the public with a readership that mattered. And so that meant that I had to go back and learn my sixth ancient language, Coptic, because much of it was in Coptic, and launched in my institution in New York, launched a whole bunch of new students who also wanted these new texts to compare with. And that meant that a bunch of them and we started really studying this for their own PhDs. What that meant for me is that I now know that there are still too many new books out there that all of us have been ignoring. And my turn towards it happened also in this book. I remember when Erin wrote a paper for our seminar, and she showed us how the texts themselves were still coming into being in the 2nd and 3rd century, that writing wasn't the big thing, talking with one another was the big thing. Yet another turn towards something new. Thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point that actually shows up more towards the end of the book. And in some ways, I wish that was towards the beginning. That was one of the moments when I went, oh my gosh, of course that's the case. I mean, I'm a historian. I understand how texts come to be. They are often talked or performed into existence long before they exist as written form, especially in the cultures that you all are studying. And so I don't know why I just never thought about that. So that was a kind of a moment of aha for me too. Thank you for that very much, Erin. So go ahead, Tripp.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the things I think that would be helpful is for you to give a brief intro of all the new content that scholars like yourself work with, right? So if by the end of the book we recognize that even the selection, let's say, of what's in the New Testament, or the selection of texts that are constantly being worked on and remembered and re-remembered, and then like who's making the decisions, there's all the complications just around the canon. But then throughout the book, you bring in archaeology, you bring in texts that we're piecing together from fragments. You start to then draw chronologies of texts where you realize what was available when and to whom. And it's like this rich picture shows up in that gap from after Jesus to before Christianity of a church alive and figuring itself out and working it out on the ground in all this multiplicity of ways. And it's like energizing and exciting, right? Like I feel that energy with what in the world could the Christianity be if we aren't like the stewards of Christendom and empire? That's exciting. And we don't know. And we're going to have one of these periods again if we're lucky. But like for a scholarly community to move past this huge inertia of Christendom going, this is what we do when we read. We figure out the best text and we translate, and they're the canon. Like, what were the historical kind of finds and documents that kind of forced this investigation, right? Like we knew you did as a Jesus seminar, we have that progress, but Westar's also created this whole other research group this comes out of. Like, what do lay people not know about that made this kind of project energized, exciting, and necessary?
Oh, how long do we have? I mean, part of the thing we're dancing around here, and it came up in the issue about these texts were performed, these writings were performed, is we've been fixated for most of the history of New Testament scholarship on texts. We keep using the damn word texts. They're not texts, they're writings. Writings are very different. Text is an artifact in a different kind of way. Writings have a life to them, and they are something that evolve and change and shift. But we've restricted our evidence for so long just to the canon of the New Testament. Well, that got blown open, beginning with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi stuff. All of a sudden, we've got all this other material that's also writings. But at the same time, archaeology has just exploded. So we know so much more about the cultures that were going on. There's been a similar kind of revolution has gone on in classical studies. So it's no longer the study of the classics, it's the study of the social world, the Greco-Roman society. So all those things begin to coalesce so that we're dealing with just huge masses of evidence that just weren't on the table 20 or 30 years ago. It radically changes the way you can put these things together. So that from that point of view of the availability of the evidence and what we can make of it, the canon, which is a 4th century product, looks pretty late. Doesn't mean some of the documents in it aren't in this period. They are almost all, but they're not in it as canon. They're in it as individual competing writings. And that changes the dynamic of how you no longer have this cohesive way that the canon gives you to organize the material. You have to find other ways to organize it. And one of the ways we find they were organizing stuff was around resistance to the Roman Empire. That becomes a huge topic in this period, and it's central to the book. Whereas if you look at things from the point of view of the 4th century, it's not resistance to the empire that's important, it's how to get along with it. It's a completely different problem. So,
and do you think for people that may not know, you said Nag Hammadi and Qumran. Hal, you said we could ask y'all individual questions. Could you say something for what happened with the discovery of text Nag Hammadi at Qumran? Like, what happened to your average Bible reader that you are not doing the best job you can do if you don't get the resources in the context of these huge discoveries?
Thanks so much, Tripp. Let me take that step a step or two back, because they're really important for us to notice what happened. The very possibility that 150 new texts were discovered since 1850. That was way more than had been discovered for the previous 1,000 years. So why did that happen? Two things happened. One was that the people who were going to the northern part of Africa and the Mediterranean basin started to be relatively wealthy Europeans to take vacations, among them Bible scholars. They didn't know that what was going to happen. They basically were walking into a whole world where there were a bunch of texts that people didn't know. And so that happened, number one, because new people came there that were interested in the Bible. The second big thing that happened is a wonderful natural occurrence, and that is dryness in North Africa. That is, turns out that, let's say, if we take the book of the Acts of Paul and Thecla, if that is in, let's say, Greece or Italy, some 1,000 or 2 years ago, the papyrus literally disappears because it's too wet. Take the same documents and put them in North Africa, where we found most of them, and they're still there.
Right.
There was still a whole bunch of stuff there. And then for the last more than 150 years, people have been ravaging actually all of that stuff, often stealing the material from the people there, then finally paying a lot of money for it. So all of that is, we now have so many texts that are in museum basements and library basements. We haven't even unfurled a bunch of the texts that are yet to be found.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about that, listening to you talk, and this is the difference between doing the more contemporary stuff that I do and the kinds of history that you all do, is that once you have those texts, they are mostly in basements, they are mostly in museums, they're rare, they're hard to get a hold of. But in recent years, hasn't more of that stuff been digitized, giving more scholars more access and easier ways to compare databases because of technology? So we have the interest, we have the discovery, the texts themselves, and now we have tools that actually bring the texts to whole new audiences that might not have had the resources to go to the texts when the texts were simply in basements or what have you. I think that's a really interesting change as well in scholarship, is access.
You want to pick that up, Aaron?
Yeah, I think I think when it comes to certain kinds of documents, that's certainly the case. And one resource that I have found particularly helpful when it comes to understanding these early centuries of the Common Era are all of the documentary papyri that we found from these dry locations, as Hal has mentioned, places where everyday kinds of documents have been preserved. So we find the records of one person suing another person to get their cloak back because they stole it while they were in the bathhouse, or we find records of a local guild who wanted to record the dream that their founder had about the local god that enabled them to set up this kind of local cult. And so these documentary papyri and inscriptions are increasingly available online. And for me, they are one of our richest resources when it comes to understanding just the everyday social lives of people at this time. So I would for sure go to that kind of evidence. And it's evidence that we bring into the book, of course, as well, at a lot of different points.
Do you think someone could summarize briefly like what all the work is that went into this book? Right. So if you read after Jesus, before Christianity, you're going to read not just a work written by three New Testament scholars that are teaching or recently retired and training people to deal with these texts. You're also getting the benefit of a community of scholarship at Westar that spent years writing the kind of super nerdy papers that you win when you get into double-digit readers. You know, like once you got that 10th reader, you're like, oh, junk, you know, like there's so much that went into this that y'all synthesized and like amazingly wrote, where it sounds like there's one voice throughout the whole book and it's not super nerdy and painful. So kind of like take us back to what happened and all that goes into this book for those that want to know what the best scholarship is saying about this period. You bring it together in a way that is, well, I mostly just felt inadequate when I got done reading the book. I thought I won't succeed like this as a scholar, but I could at least interview them.
The seminar lasted 10 years, and it took us, what, 9 to 10 months to write the book? Was that basically how long it was?
More.
More? It wasn't a year, I don't think, but it was so painful we have forgotten. No, it was actually a very good, it was a wonderful experience, as a matter of fact, and a great learning experience. But it went on for 10 years. But it's not just the 20 people in the seminar. Besides those people, we brought in over and over again experts who were on the topic, who weren't members of the seminars, and they would present specialized papers on topics that we needed to get the info on. And the seminar stands on the shoulders of scholarship that's been going on for the last 30 or 40 years. It's not independent of that scholarship. It really is based upon it. What we did, I think you're right. What we did was try to synthesize and advance that scholarship. And to my mind, one of the great things that happened in the writing of the book, and it was due to the give and take of the three of us, was we actually, for the first time, are the first group of people who've tried to put it all together. It's basically all out there in technical research that you got to dig for and find, you know, it's all over the place. And because of the seminar and the way it worked and the way we were assigned to write the book, to make it have one voice, we ended up creating a kind of a unification of this material, a synthesis. Unification is too strong. There's too many holes, too many gaps. And one has to be honest about that. But I think it's a synthesis of where the question is right now.
It's
You know,
interesting. Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
We really started, the work of the seminar started with the idea of the master narrative, which we bring in at the beginning of the book. We, and when I use the word we, it's really collective we. We've told this singular story about the history of Christianity for a very, very, very long time. This story that suggests that you know, at the beginning of the first century of the Common Era, this person named Jesus appeared on the scene and did some pretty extraordinary things and taught extraordinary things and amassed this group of followers. Jesus was crucified under the Roman Empire, and after his death, his followers transmitted his teachings in this kind of holistic, harmonious way to the next generation. And that next generation became the church leaders who kept transmitting his message in this harmonious way. And it was this very unified picture of how Christianity came to be. And the Christianity seminar at Westar wanted to ask, well, how do we know this to be true? Is this story actually true? Because this is a story that was a much later product. So we wanted to try to question that master narrative and to go back as far as we could to the beginning. And instead of reading what we know of later Christianity backwards and saying, okay, well, we see this happening in the first century, this looks like something that happens later, so we can match these two together. We wanted to try to, you know, you can never unknow things that we know, of course, but we wanted to take all of our assumptions about the future of Christianity out of the picture as far as we could, because the future is not inevitable, and see what happened when we set that master narrative aside. And when we in fact did that, that's when we find all of these incredible new voices, all of these incredible new stories, right? So it came from that kind of experimentation with that master narrative.
What you're saying there in some ways is not all that terribly different than a really controversial thing that's going on right now with North American history. And that is, if you think about 1620 and 2020, that's 400 years, 4 centuries. And what the teaching of particularly North American history has been to this point is through the lens of now looking back. And recently, a group of scholars said, hey, let's look at 1620 instead, 1619 exactly, and see about the diverse experiences of persons of color, people who were at the bottom of the economic scale, rather than these elite Virginians, essentially, who created this idea of democratic society. And if we tell the story from the perspective there and work our way forward, rather than starting at the end with these massive wealthy countries of the United States and Canada, what do we see? And that's basically the same thing that you're doing here in this book. And I think that it's very hard for sometimes when readers of the Bible don't understand that 400 years is a long period of time, and things change over 400 years. And so the way that someone really saw the event, 10 years after Jesus died versus the putting together of the canon some 350 years later, that's an astonishingly distant historical reality. I mean, and the sets of lenses that can develop, et cetera, are just really interesting. So I thought there was a really fascinating comparison between the project that you all have been doing, placing yourself at the beginning and trying to work toward understanding that 400 years, with some of the work being done right now in North American history around Indigenous people and people who were held in slavery, both. And these are controversial projects, and you can see that obviously in the comment thread if you're keeping an eye on it the way that I am, and that's okay. That's exactly what historians should be doing, stirring up this kind of venture and just saying, which way do we look? For people who haven't read the book, there's at the very beginning, these authors in the synthesis list 6 points that they think are shared in the diversities of Christianities in these 2 centuries, the first 2 centuries of Christianity. So there's no singular thing called Christianity, but there are these.
There are no Christianities either.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's no Christianities either, because you take a long time with that word. And I love what you do with that word. From now on, it's just the communities of the anointed one.
We're so habituated to saying it that it's very difficult to get it out of your brain.
Yeah, I know. It really is. And I love the language that you developed here. But so I can't wait to hear you talk a little bit more about that. I just want to lay these 6 things out, and then we're going to dive into that part of it. That these people who somehow found themselves in conversation with one another and Jesus, that there were 6 things that do seem to be largely shared. And that is, 1, they resisted the Roman Empire. 2, they practiced gender bending. That was the one that just I love how you handled this in the book. 3, they live in chosen families. 4, they claim belonging to Israel. And thank you. You go enormous directions in relieving anti-Semitic interpretations here. I mean, you cast real new light, I think, on the relationship of these communities and Judaism, or maybe being Jewish, because there's probably no Judaism either at that point in time. 5, they have diverse organizational structures, and 6, they had persisting oral traditions. And so those are the 6 things. Tripp, do we want to just go with which things that? How about if we go with which thing each one of you sort of felt was the most important to you, or the thing that really pressed into your work with the most passion? Which of those sort of 6 areas
For me, that's a pretty hard question, Diana.
I know they're connected, but I'm really
I
curious.
want to basically say that bringing it down to 6 was we had to cheat to do that, because what we found was so much of our colleagues of the last 40 years had really broken so many barriers that I'm not sure exactly what. It seems to me that what really happens with those 6 is we realize that there are multiplenesses of realities there. And to think about the first 2 centuries, we have to not think uniformly. We have to think in complex, new kinds of varieties. And what if it's the new kinds of varieties that are still there after 2 centuries? What if that is a heart of what a future could be like? So I'm going to refuse to say there's one, because I think one of the key things that's happening in the Christianities that wrote themselves is they insisted on there being one thing. And I think when you look at even the canonical gospels, those were picked because they're 4 different ones. They don't agree. So yes, multiplicity.
Is anybody gonna take me up on my question, or are y'all gonna just
I'll
treat me
refuse
like
making
Al
one.
there?
I mean, I will answer the question in a partial way. To me, one of the parts on that, I agree with Hal. You can't pull one out. That doesn't work. And you also should notice the list is positive. We're not deconstructing in that list. If we were going to do that, we'd put there's no Christianity as the first one, but that's a negative. So we were trying to lead with the positives. But the gender bending, to me, is, I think, one of the most fascinating things that comes out of this. The meal traditions, the oral traditions. I spent my whole life studying orality because I started in parables. So, I mean, all that stuff is very important. But the gender bending, to see how that was actually working, I hadn't put that together at all. That was completely new. I mean, I knew the parts, but I hadn't really sorted it out in any way at all. And that was interesting and amazing to me to see it come together. Fascinating.
Is there a particular story you might like to hold up as an example for people who haven't read the book about how the gender bending?
Well, I think there's
works
2
in
ways
here?
to look at it. One is Paul. I mean, the Corinthian communities, you can tell from reading the Corinthian communities, he really thinks there's no male or female, and they're bending gender all over the place. And sometimes it gets out of hand because the man starts speaking with his mother-in-law. And Paul thinks that's bending it a little too far. So, I mean, it's a contest that you really, if you don't know where you are, you have to explore it. And in a sense, they're making it up as they go along. That's an accurate observation of what they're doing. I think that Paul acts upon Thecla, which is probably in the late 150s, something like that. She bends gender in every which way. I mean, she's presented as a virgin in the beginning. She's espoused to a upper class Roman male. She cuts her hair, she dresses, she forms her own family, she baptizes herself. She preaches like Paul. I mean, she does everything that's contrary to a gender role. And you find that in the martyrdoms all over the place. But it's out there. And even I always like to take 1 Timothy and put it next to the Acts of Paul and Thecla, because 1 Timothy is trying to unbend the gender. And Acts of Paul and Thecla are bending it. And they're both written at the same time. They're both Pauline communities. Aaron always says it shouldn't be called the Acts of Paul and Thecla because it's really the Acts of Thecla. She's right. But Paul is in there because they want to say, we belong to this tradition. This is the tradition we belong to. And they're arguing with somebody like you find in 1 Timothy. They're going after it. That's fascinating to see.
Do you think one of the like when you give that example, I talked to a number of ministers who all like went to, mainline Protestant seminaries, who are in the group and are reading this, and everyone, the constant reply was, I feel like I knew 85% that was in there. It was just the way it was organized for a cumulative argument made everything I learned in seminary that's embarrassing to bring up in a sermon seem so much cooler. And I think underneath that is that what you were saying at the beginning, like part of it is shifting that master narrative, that once there isn't some like destined perfect conclusion established by God before the foundation of the earth that you get to at Nicaea or at the end of the ecumenical councils, or like every good Bible believer at the first real Baptist, then all of a sudden, like all this new data we get about the actual lives of those baptized into the body of Christ in the early church become this beautiful witness to a manifold, a multiplicity of encounters with the divine, and everyone's sharing it and trying to figure out what to do. And then what happens, right? When you set aside that, as a process person, the misplaced concreteness that Christianity does is it goes right back through the tradition and tells us how to read it all. And what you lay out is like, no, like your family tree, if you've been grafted into Team Jesus and then the story of Abraham, it's like packed full of diversity and questions and wrestling. And these little things we notice, say martyrdom issues. Once you put the martyrdom stories in the patriarchal context that are there, you realize that the Christian church was telling stories about martyrs that perform stereotypical patriarchal gender roles and then undo them. And then you throw on top of it that they're playing out the hero myths, but then who is the hero? Not the anticipated ones. Like you start going through it. And so we had this text exchange with all my friends from Div School that are in the group, and they're like, oh, all of that stuff we learn all of a sudden are like bring it home moments in a sermon and not the things we don't know what to do. So like, I don't know the exact question that comes after that, but just to go, no one has stated emphatically just how awesome it is and exciting. And what the invitation is when this part of our history is opened up and allowed to breathe. It's good news that we get to breathe, because so many of us, that abstracted, essentialized picture of Christianity becomes something we either take or leave, and it feels like a burden for many. And all of a sudden we find out our birth story is much more complicated and exciting than anticipated.
Looks like Aaron want to jump in.
I'm so excited by what you just said, Tripp. I totally agree with you. I think this book is good news. I think it can be challenging to consider that the first 2 centuries were full of so many different groups that weren't calling themselves Christian at all, but were using all of these different kinds of names and or understanding their relationships to each other and to Jesus in many cases and to God and all of these different kinds of ways. That can feel overwhelming, and that can feel like a deconstruction or like we're creating absence. But in fact, I think when we consider all of the vibrant ways in which these people were trying to interact with each other, at the core of these groups was this idea of belonging and of finding safe space to belong to each other in the violent circumstances of the Roman Empire. And if we think about these groups in terms of belonging at the core, that they're just looking for ways to not just survive, but to thrive and to belong to community under constantly changing circumstances in the Roman Empire, that's pretty exciting. And I think it's something that can give us hope as well when we're thinking about our own places of belonging in our contemporary contexts.
How do you think the exploration of gender bending in the early stages of between Jesus and Christianity helps us reframe the way we wrestle with it in the present, right? Because even say the United Methodist Church in America is about to split once COVID allows them to get together again over questions around gender and sexuality and such. And underneath those assumptions, right, for so many of our denominations are, especially Protestant ones, we're biblical and biblical Christianity has this particular answer. And then we'll fight about a few verses about how you understand it. And, you know, in one sense, what you describe in the book is that we haven't even figured out how to ask the question biblically yet. We're reading these results as if they're just immediately obvious about what's going on. But once you like put those texts and the early church communities and all the diversity in their historical context, you don't get to ask as if something's completely plain here. And in fact, they're negotiating what the bending looks like. Like, you know, we already had the example of it got bit too far in Corinth, but then you encounter Timothy and you're like, I think you should start stretching in the morning. It would be good for you. You know, so like when you think of wrestling with an issue like this, what kind of gifts does it give for those of us in the present when we understand the tradition in a more vibrant and alive way?
I'm not sure that the past has some solution for us. It feels to me as if the really wonderful thing that's going on is the mix up and the gender bending in our time that's different than the gender bending in those first 2 centuries. So I would want to have a relationship between these ancient texts and us as a vibrant one in which we're learning from each other. And for me, that just brings more and more to the table for us to begin to be diverse in complicated and open-ended ways.
I really agree with Hal. You can't turn to the Bible to find answers. I mean, people want to do that, but that's nonsense. I hate to be so blunt about it, but that is. Mary Beard, who's an eminent British classicist historian, at the end of her book on SPQR, which is a great survey of Roman history, she asks, well, what can these Romans teach us today? And she says, absolutely nothing. We can't learn anything directly from them. What we can learn from them is about ourselves. That in conversation with them and in trying to understand themselves, we understand ourselves from a different way. And I think when we engage with this material, that's what it does. It helps us questions all of our assumptions. It doesn't tell you what you should do, but it helps put those calls into question assumptions we've made, ways we see things, and says, no, you can experiment. You could try this differently. It doesn't tell you exactly what to do. It's not that direct. That's just a hermeneutical mistake, I think. But you really learn about yourself in exploring other cultures. That's a really opening up of yourself to other things that are in your tradition.
One of the things that I thought was interesting, just, I'm listening to this conversation really closely and looking at the 6 points and having read finished reading the book today, is it really strikes me that the whole argument that you're constructing, the synthesis you're drawing, fits into the sort of larger world of religious studies as well, because those 6 things that you come up with are basically kind of 6 parameters of what people in my field refer to. So now we're over at the AAR instead of the SBL for geeks. But over at the American Academy of Religion, we would say that these 6 things were the parameters of religious movements. And so what you've very successfully done is shown how this sort of early life of these variety of Jesus communities fit under this rubric of religious movement rather than single denomination or theological worldview or structured, liturgical stuff or what have you. And so to me, when I hear, Brandon, your comment, what Hal was just saying, and Tripp's question, is not so much that the Bible provides answers. You don't go to the Bible and look for the answers, or the Romans don't tell us what to do. but rather there's some sort of, I think, the part of the conversation is the idea that when religions are in this movement stage, the kinds of creativities that they bring forth, the openness to possibilities, the breaking through patterns of violence that they potentially offer, is like, it can be life-giving. It can be a path towards the creation of something that is helpful to human flourishing. And so anyway, I was just kind of in my own mind thinking about how some of these things you could say, hey, yeah, well, hey, in the 20th century, Pentecostals resisted empire. They practiced gender bending. They lived in chosen families. They claimed belonging to Israel. They had diverse organizational structures, and they had persisting oral traditions. And Pentecostalisms wind up being and Harvey Cox's amazing work on this, plus tons of other scholars, of course, but the Pentecostalisms wind up being the most dynamic forms of contemporary Christian life across the planet. And they've lent themselves in a variety of settings up until fairly recently to challenging systems and structures of oppression. And so I think that that's a really good example, Brandon, of what I think you're saying, is that in that sense, you don't just go back to the Bible and say, what's the answer here? But you can see this sort of dynamism that unfolds in these particular kinds of settings. And so 20th century Pentecostalism, in effect, is like first century, what you're describing, in how it responds to power, oppression, and violence, and how it provides safety, which is one of Aaron's obviously big themes, and also what it does with women and men. So I think that kind of exemplar conversation, encouragement, is more of what is going on here than strictly the right answer from the biblical text. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When the AAR person comes into the conversation.
But we all use the same categories. We just go to different meetings.
Yeah, that's true. Tripp, did you want to follow up a question? Or are we getting towards the end here?
Oh, well, yeah, there are two big topics that came up we haven't talked about yet. And I have a question I want to ask at the end, because it was the question I had after I finished the book. So I still want to convince everyone to go read the book. One of the themes that runs throughout early in the book is the way in which the political shift from a minority population, the worshiping one who died cross dead, all that kind of stuff, shifting all the way to Christendom. When you look at resistance to Roman Empire being an essential factor across all the different Christianities and things that could end up being one later, how would you describe that, and what kind of elements in the research, particular text or archaeology or background, would kind of help make a text or two that we all are familiar with, if we know the New Testament, come alive again? And all of a sudden you go, oh, this is what they mean when they go, yeah, like basically before there was Christianity, all the Jesus followers were figuring out what to do with the resistance to empire. Because most of us that know those texts were trained to knowing them and memorizing them for competitions and Bible memorization, as very good stewards of the current empire. So as a historian, what are some of the kind of the data and background and things that bring that emphasis you agreed on to the fore in ways that defamiliarize maybe us with some of the texts that we're comfortable with?
Brandon, I feel like you should talk about the use of the word Christian in Acts here. That's pretty game changing.
I'm not sure how we're supposed to go here, because you think that's a response to his question?
I do. Yeah. I mean, I think that the way in which we heard the word
Oh,
Christian in the book of
okay.
Acts would really change the way people interact with that text. Yeah.
All right. We have traditionally, people have argued that the first instance of the use of the word Christian is in Acts, and they were called Christian in Antioch. And people assumed Acts was written fairly early, so therefore they called themselves Christians, and you had the Christian religion started very, very early. Actually, Acts is probably after 125. It's certainly not in the first century. And if it's after 125, then the earliest use of that word is in Pliny, in Latin. And the IAN ending in Greek indicates it's a Latin loanword. It means to belong to the party of. So if we translated the word Christianos instead of transliterating it, just bringing the letters over, you wouldn't say Christian, you would say those who belong to the party of the anointed, or those who belong to the party of the Messiah, if you want to make it, or those who belong to the party of the Jewish Messiah, if you want to really get in your face. So that when Pliny brings these people up on charges, he doesn't think they belong to a Christian religion. He thinks they belong to a Jewish sect, which shows allegiance to the Messiah. He thinks it's a messianic group of some kind. So it's a completely different kind of construction. And you see the whole thing there in the Pliny letter. It's resistance to Rome. He understands it's resistance to Rome, and he's going to stop it. So, I mean, you see it right there. It's also gender bending because he notes that the two leaders of this group are two female slaves, which is really kind of interesting. That gets completely blown. People don't even notice that. It's an important point to him because he can torture them. They can just feel free to go ahead and torture them to see what the heck they might say. So you see almost all the elements that we bring out in those first things are right there in the letter of Pliny, and that's the first usage of the term. It's a fascinating usage. It just doesn't mean Christian. It means those who adhere or belong to the party of the anointed. You're declaring who you belong to. Identity is not central in the ancient world. They don't even really understand it. What's central is who you belong to. That's what defines a person.
I actually
and how
wanted,
did the-
I love that so much. I wanted to just go out and get my card, you know, and then I kept thinking that baptism is in effect supposed to be that card. I belong to the party of the anointed one. And I think I want to preach on it all during the rest of Lent. I mean, I'll be a card carrying member of the party of the anointed one.
Well, it fundamentally changes the way you think about it.
Yeah, really.
So,
Yeah.
and then if you take a simple example, like we've always translated Basileia tu Theou as the empire of God, as the kingdom of God, which means nothing. But if you translate it as the empire of God, all of a sudden it's a political idea, which has implications.
And for people who are listening, one of the things that you all do with this, I don't know where the impulse to do it comes from, but you point out how these, like that, to say this is the empire of God rather than just the kingdom of God. It's in your face, but it's also kind of funny because the people who are part of the party of the anointed one know that their empire is nothing like the Roman Empire. And so there's this underlying kind of imperial joke, that sense of humor that's running through all of these writings. And I thought that sparkled. It really makes the text come alive.
And if you put that together with Tripp's question just a few moments ago, to ask the question of what are the creative dimensions of this, it isn't that there are answers, it's that there is stunningly scary and difficult things going on in almost everybody's life. And so what would it be And I think this is where we were helped a lot by the scholars of the last 30 years, in which finally we had begun for a decade or two or three, we began studying it, the violence of that larger society. And it turns out that for us, it was to get the safety and to get the release. We basically folks were working on resistance, just stopping some of it, and secondly, to be creative, and have all kinds of big questions about how we can build communities together on another basis than violence. And so that meant that all of these different groups were going in different directions to find creative communities. And they knew that they shouldn't all come together. They should be the kind of communities that were opening themselves up to each other.
What were a few of the strategies of safety that developed?
Well, both Aaron and Brandon have already mentioned this, but we haven't focused on that. So we thought that the main thing that everybody did was have long meals together. And that in and of itself was a chance for talking in new ways with one another, having arguments, having time to just lay around and drink.
And eat.
It turns out that that's what everybody felt like they had to do, not to do some ritual like a church, but to simply take time for one another in a counter community.
I often
love to hear Aaron and Brandon really kind of fill some of that out with the meals.
I often feel like that church suppers are the closest thing most churches do to what went on in the early Jesus movements. Everything else they do has no resemblance to what went on there. I'm actually very serious about that. The safety thing, the meals are primary. Remember, food is an issue in this culture. Most people live on less than 1,000 calories a day. That's below Atkins. We would call that a diet. That's their, the empire has trouble supplying food. So people live on the edge. And if you share together and you can eat and drink, that's safety. The telling of the stories, you create a common bond, they share things. I mean, we know this is going on. We see lots of evidence of it. They form what we would call fictive families. It's kind of odd. These early groups are always running into trouble with their natural families, but then they form fictive families, new families together. That's a way of creating solidarity. And then finally, you see in the martyr stories, taking the empire on is okay. It might cost you your life, but you're not living in fear. And you see this, I mean, this is perfectly modern. You see this going on today in Ukraine. They could easily just say, oh, we'll let the Russians in because they're going to get really hammered hard, but it might be worth it. So, I mean, these are basic human phenomena when you come up against authoritarianism that require response.
Aaron, do you have some comments on the meal piece? I thought that was really, this is a great discussion. I'd like to just hear what you'd add here.
Yeah, so when it comes to, sorry, my dog is coming in and out of the room. Oh, now he wants out. Okay, there he goes. Okay. When it comes to the meals, I'd really encourage us to, if folks in the audience are interested, you can Google things like voluntary associations or ancient supper clubs. They were a really popular form of communal organization, one that the empire did have a problem with. So we are talking about resistance to empire here again. These groups could form for lots of different reasons. They might form around ethnicity. So they might be a group of migrants from a particular location who are displaced due to empire. They might be a group who bonded together because they shared the same profession. They were all wool dyers or something like that. Or they formed an association because they shared an allegiance to a particular divinity or a deity. And we see that association model was really popular amongst the early Jesus movements. And meal practice, again, was central to these groups. And that's where evidence from papyri becomes really exciting as well, because we can see how important lots of these groups had extensive rules on food sharing to make sure that everybody got a fair amount of food. I translated one rules and regulations document for an association was talking about the equitable distribution of donuts of their shared pastries, wanting to make sure that everybody got their own pastry, right? And they had rules for how you were supposed to behave with one another in a respectful and moral manner. So I think we can also see, if we're looking for ideas about morality and social interaction, that was really important to these communities as well. So this meal practice comes from this association or supper club model. And then again, we have the chosen families, which is so important here. And of course, meals would be shared in families as well. And I think what's particularly important to consider with these chosen families is that a lot of these chosen families were headed by formerly enslaved or enslaved persons who would have been part of households, Roman households, but not even considered persons. Enslaved persons were often just called bodies in ancient literature. So to see these chosen families forming, particularly amongst the enslaved and formerly enslaved persons, is very, very powerful.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh man. So my favorite part of the book, it was like, where I was listening to the audiobook while walking dogs. So where you hit pause and then pull up the Google Doc and add it to your, when this comes around and I'm preaching this again, this is definitely going in bit, was your exploration of how the origin of the gospel stories, once you recognize that they're oral for so long, and how they're enlivened when you start to set them alongside how biographies function in that time period, and how memorials in specifically function, and that part of what's happening in the text when you're exploring the Gospel of Mark is, what does it mean to be a community of people in a time of crisis gathered around absence? And I was just like, oh, that's so good. So I want to hear y'all talk about that, but I'm also asking it because anyone that's a minister that's listening to this, like those 9 pages are like 2 very high quality sermon material, like beyond measure. And it's just like ridiculous not to get a book for 2 excellent sermon references. So this is like the wetting of the beak to go get it just for that one bit. It was so good.
Well,
Oh, thanks.
I think Erin should close that off. She did a lot of that work.
This is a particularly exciting area for me. And I'm going to say it's one that I'm still working out. So I don't yet have definitive statements or answers for you, but I'm still so excited about where this work, especially on Mark, might go. I love the writing that we now call the Gospel of Mark. And it's received a lot of criticism in biblical scholarship in particular, for being, it's really short. It has a very strange ending. It doesn't really have an ending, actually. The women leave and they don't say anything and they're just afraid. That's not a great ending to a story. Scholars have always criticized Mark's Greek, and I say he's not literate. And I just thought that Mark was getting a really bad rap, and I was curious as to why Mark exists in this particular form, and why we might be so critical of Mark. And I think it's because Mark isn't well, it's definitely not a text, as Brandon would know, but it's not a book, and it's not even a story the way we might traditionally understand story. This is and even we tend to look to later church leaders like the Bishop Irenaeus, who we've made famous because he refers to, we thought, 4 gospels, and this was our earliest evidence for 4 gospels. But when you really look at that quotation from Irenaeus, he's actually referring to different kinds of written things. He uses the word gospel, but not of all of the 4. He just calls Mark a written thing, essentially. He calls Mark an object writtenly, if you're translating it literally. And I was like, what's an object writtenly? An object writtenly. But it makes so much more sense of Mark, because what Mark is doing is trying to create a community for people who are grieving, and who are themselves continuing to suffer trauma, and they can't deal with that grief in typical ways, in the ways that were normally socially available to people. So they created this written-ish thing with which people could interact in lots of different kinds of ways. And I found some parallel evidence from an association, a local club, who were also struggling with not just the loss of their group leader, but the absent body of that leader, and how they were supposed to come to terms with that. And I was just so taken by the similarities between what I saw going on Mark and what I saw going on in this particular writing. I began to think, well, maybe this isn't, a writing the way we typically understand it. Maybe this is an act of memorial, and we need to understand it and interact with it in a much more dynamic way. I'm still not totally sure what that way is, right? Because I think it's very different for me living in 2022 than it was for folks living in the first century, how they would have interacted with this text. So I'm still trying to inhabit that mindset, but it's one that I continue to be excited about trying to inhabit.
Well, and one of the things I would just say, as someone that heard it and got so excited, is that gathering around absence, that a community knows to be ourselves, we have to retell the story, and the story is one of loss, is such a different identifying way of telling a story than Christendom has taught us. The dominant expression of being Christian is telling a story where the origin and history of your tradition and your particular expression now are connected by a line of certainty, objectivity, finality, and absoluteness, right? Like that master narrative you're dethroning right at the beginning of the book, going, yeah, this doesn't work if you just are honest. Underneath it, though, is a threat to those of us that think articulating the faith as a Christian means justifying the meta narrative. And one of the things in recognizing that you could, the gospel, Mark, the oldest canonized gospel, is connected to telling the story of the one who's gone, because we don't know who we are without their presence. That entangled in your identity as one of absence, death on a cross, not the justification of the cross building power, but allegiance to the cross bearer. Underneath all that, I was just like, oh my God, that's so good. That's so good. I just got pumped. I got pumped. And, a preacher won't be as, he won't dissect the details like you did. We'll take you, footnote you, and then we'll bring it on home. What does it mean? Anyway. But it's exciting. All right, Diana, we have time for each of us to ask one last question. So do you want to go first or last?
I feel like I've asked my questions. So I just my brain is full, and I'm I'm going to listen to whatever ends up here. Yeah, I think this has been wonderful.
Okay, this is Tripp's nagging question, and
Okay.
so
I can't wait to hear Tripp's nagging question.
no, I got done, and you know how when you read a book, and if it's one author, you then, I don't know, maybe you all don't do this, occasionally have dreams where you're just talking to them. It happens to me occasionally where you're like who you were reading, you're like now talking to, but I didn't know who I was talking to when finishing this book. And one of the classes I'm currently doing is a cross-listed class in philosophy of religion. So I have linguistics, philosophy people in it, religion people in it, and then history ones. At least all sorts of questions when you're introducing how philosophers think of religion. Same time, one of our research seminars here at the University of Edinburgh has been on what does the word tradition even mean for a religion, right? And you've been problematizing both. And one of the things that tends to happen, just in looking at how few Christians have attempted to define tradition after the Enlightenment, very few, like Cardinal Newman did it. That's triggering. David Bentley Hart has a new book that did it, and it's but there are very few that spend a lot of time are arguing about tradition, but most people tell their own story where there is one. So the dogmatists, the traditionalist kind, tell the story of the tradition where, in some sense, any change is an abomination, right? And that's the master narrative you're critiquing, that like the idea that there was no change and there's no multiplicity and fluctuation, that's a problem for them. But then you have what I guess our natural tendency is more liberally minded progressive academic types, is that to see a purpose in the tradition and what's getting itself done throughout that the multiplicity of journeys is problematic. And a lot of our tools as a historian are to go like, well, that's fiction, because we don't bring something like the divine or spirit or something like into understanding history. And so I feel like those two tensions in your story, it's too beautiful to be completely purposeless and not to be gained in the present. And there's no like single story. So like between those kind of extremes of historicist, dismissal, everything that's not, settled, we then dismiss it and it's relativized, and we have to have the one pure thread. Like, how do you as scholars then see the Christian traditions or traditioning or whatever way you want to use the word, when in our present, when we think of ourselves being part of something that includes all the diversity you described about, right? From the resistance to empire, to gender bending, to chosen families, to different institutions and stuff. How do you think about the concept of tradition? I had multiple answers I thought y'all might come up with. It didn't like any of them. And then dream about talking to you. And
well, I'll start on that question that lasts a half hour or so. Yeah, a little bit. No, I think for me, it's slowly appearing to me that what if it's just a 2-century thing that is in process, not complete, not going in a particular way, but a whole bunch of differences meeting in the middle of unbelievable difficulty. That I think seems to me to be much better than a sealed off tradition. And why wouldn't we want to learn from the complexity of meeting loss and violence head on with humor, courage, and community? Yeah. That's not community. That's down for me deeper in humanity itself.
I've thought a lot about tradition because I come from a tradition as a Catholic that, values scripture and tradition and puts a little emphasis on scripture, frankly. But I have several quick things. I basically agree with Hal. I don't disagree with him at all. I want to say three quick things. One, if you're going to argue from tradition, why does it have to start in the 4th century? Why can't it start earlier? I just don't get that. What makes that century the century in which tradition starts? Just because Eusebius created the master narrative, we're stuck with it forever? I don't get that. Secondly, I think one has to really recognize that there has never been a tradition. There's always been traditions, and they've been conflictive. Experimentation did not stop in the first 2 centuries. It's been going on throughout the entire history of Christianity. It has reinvented itself multiple times, and it will either die or reinvent itself again. So I don't know which one's going to happen. I'm not a prophet. I'm a historian. I look backwards, not forwards. And the third thing, I have for quite a long time thought the 2 bad deals the church has made were with Neoplatonism and Constantine. Those were fundamental mistakes in which the churches went off the rails, frankly, and they've had a very difficult time getting back on the rails.
I love that that's mentioned in the book.
Yes.
I think for me, when it comes to understanding tradition, I mean, one of the primary meanings for the Latin word from which tradition comes is a giving up, a surrendering. And in the context of this book, I like that particular meaning of tradition, because I think that we need to be willing to give some things up, to give up some assumptions, to challenge the things that we think we know, to ask really tough questions, to give up some sense of total certainty in favor of curiosity. Not a negative uncertainty, but I'm going to say a curiosity. So I like that primary meaning of tradition as a kind of giving up or surrender, but it can also have a meaning in the Latin of an entrusting or a confiding, or a commitment to community, to protection and to shelter. And I think if we're talking about tradition in the sense of this kind of commitment to safety or belonging, that's really interesting. So I'm trying to kind of reconfigure how we understand this word tradition based on some of its earliest meanings and the opportunities that these earlier meanings give us for understanding tradition, not necessarily as a harmonious string of kind of teaching or instruction, but perhaps a continuous commitment to one another to protect each other.
Awesome.
I actually love that, Aaron, the Episcopal, I'm an Episcopalian, the Episcopal House of Bishops is meeting right now for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. And I love reminding my friends who are bishops that one of the earliest understanding of what a bishop's job was to guard tradition. And it meant to stand between the community and the Romans when the Romans came knocking on the door. So basically, that's one of the jobs of the bishop, is to put the bishop's body on the line in solidarity with the community over and against the violence of empire. And so whenever I remind them of that, they just always kind of look at me like going, really? And it's like, yes, really.
That was the big issue with Cyprian in North Africa, that he did that and other bishops didn't, and he wanted them thrown out. So
I sided with Cyprian on that one.
Yeah.
You all are wonderful. And all I can say is, friends who are listening to this call, if any of these great people ever come to speak at a university or a church near you, go and hear them. and listen to their latest research, the wisdom they've gained over years of doing this work. I mean, it's just a feast. And their book is a readable feast of scholarship that preachers will love, because every page presents a new sermon for you. Folks like myself who preaches sermons, but nevertheless, I'm not ordained. I'm a layperson who just loves thinking about scripture and faith. This is something you can read and really wrestle with, and it's wonderful. And it's also a great book for introducing students to first-rate biblical scholarship, first-rate scholarship of first and second centuries. So it has incredible uses, and I just can't even think of a book I more highly recommend this year than this one.
Oh, it's
Well, thank you
excellent.
so much for having us.
And remember that there's an audio version if you enjoy listening. There's digital version and print version. You can get it in all three places. And having 3 kids that listen to a lot of audiobooks, there's only like 2 weird ways that words get pronounced in the book, unlike a lot of ones that use early church things. Heretic gets a weird way, and Marcion, slightly awkward. But there are so few of them that is significantly better than normal. So that's always nice. Thank you everyone for hanging out and joining. If you're part of the group, we'll see you all Thursday. If you're not, you can obviously join. But when this is posted, we'll put links to not just the book itself, but a host of different ways you can connect with Aaron and Brandon and Hal and the work that Westar is up to, because this is one book of one of their large research programs, but they have a host of them going on. I mean, a lot of people know about the Jesus Seminar, but right now the God Seminar is alive and going. People that are part of the podcast will know people like Catherine Keller, John Cobb, let's see, Jack Caputo's a part of it. There's a number of the new materialists that have all been on at different times that are part of it. So they have a bunch of different research seminars. So you definitely want to check out what Westar's doing. And we'll put links on all the blog posts and things associated with this. So with that, I want to say thank you for everyone for hanging out live, all of you that listen, and tons of gratitude for Aaron and Hal and Brandon for this work and deciding to spend your Monday evening with us on the internet.
Thanks,
Thank you
Tripp
so
and
much.
Diana.
Thank you.
Peace to you all.
Again.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.